The afternoon sun was a warm hand on Arthur Caldwell's shoulders, filtering through the ancient oak trees that stood as silent sentinels over Westlake Park. He sat on his usual bench, the one furthest from the jogging path, closest to the duck pond. It was a simple pleasure, this small pocket of peace carved out of the city's relentless noise. In his lap rested a worn leather-bound sketchbook, its pages filled with the charcoal ghosts of faces, trees, and moments he had deemed worthy of capturing. His late wife, Eleanor, had given it to him. "So you never forget to see the world, Arthur," she had said, her voice already thinned by illness, but her spirit as bright as ever. "Not just preside over it." So he came here. He came to see. Today he sketched the determined frown of a young boy trying to sail a toy boat and the easy laughter of the teenagers on the nearby grass. He wore a simple gray hoodie, frayed at the cuffs, and a pair of faded denim jeans. A multi-day growth of salt and pepper stubble softened the sharp, judicial lines of his jaw. To the world, he was just a man. An old, black man sketching in a park. And that was exactly how he wanted it. He was so lost in the cross-hatching of a duck's wing that he didn't notice the polished black boots until they stopped directly in his line of sight, scuffing the dirt just inches from his own worn sneakers. Arthur looked up slowly. The police officer was young, with a broad chest that strained the buttons of his uniform and a haircut so severe it looked drawn on with a ruler. His name tag read Miller. His eyes, however, were ancient. They held a familiar, weary cynicism that Arthur had seen 1,000 times from his elevated seat in the courtroom. It was a look that had already tried and convicted him. "Can I help you, officer?" Arthur asked, his voice calm and even. Officer Miller didn't answer immediately. He let his gaze sweep over Arthur, from his scuffed shoes to his gray hoodie, lingering for a moment on the sketchbook as if it were contraband. The assessment was swift, brutal, and entirely incorrect. "You can't loiter here," Miller said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. It was an order. Arthur blinked. "Loitering? Officer, I'm just sitting. Sketching. This area has had a lot of complaints," Miller continued, ignoring Arthur's explanation. His hand rested on his hip, inches from his sidearm, a casual posture of intimidation. "Vagrancy. Public nuisance. You fit the description." The words hung in the warm afternoon air, ugly and sharp. Fit the description. Arthur knew that tired, venomous euphemism. It was a cornerstone of the very injustices he fought every day from behind his bench. To think, he had just been admiring the delicate balance of the legal system in a lecture he gave at the university last week. Now, its crudest instrument was standing before him, mistaking him for a crime in progress. He felt a familiar weariness settle deep in his bones, a feeling far heavier than his 62 years. He had to believe in the system. He had to. But men like Miller were the cracks in its foundation. "I assure you, I'm not a nuisance," Arthur said, keeping his tone measured. He knew the script. Any sign of agitation, any hint of anger, would be used against him. It would be twisted into aggressive behavior or resisting. "I'm just enjoying the park. This isn't a shelter," Miller shot back, his voice hardening. He pointed a thick finger at the sketchbook. "And we don't need people casing the place, pretending to be artists." The insult stung more than the accusation of vagrancy. Pretending. As if the charcoal on his fingers and the passion in his heart were a lie. This sketchbook was a sanctuary, a connection to Eleanor. Miller had just trampled on sacred ground. "It's a public park, officer," Arthur stated, his voice now carrying a new firmness. He could feel the judge within him stirring, the part of him that could not suffer fools or tolerate injustice. "And I'm a public servant telling you to move along," Miller sneered. "You got an ID?" Of course. The inevitable demand. Arthur knew he had left his wallet and his judicial robes, hanging in his chambers. He'd wanted to be unburdened today, free of the weight of his office. He had only his keys and a few loose dollars in his pocket. The irony was a bitter pill. The one day he chose to be just a man, he was being treated as less than one. "My wallet is at my office," he said truthfully. Miller let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, your office? Right. I've heard that one before. Let me guess, you're the CEO of some big company, just out here getting in touch with the common folk." The sarcasm was thick and dripping with prejudice. Several people on the jogging path slowed their pace, their curiosity piqued by the confrontation. Arthur saw their faces, a flicker of concern, but mostly a desire to not get involved. They were the silent witnesses, the jury of the uninvolved. Something like that, Arthur said quietly. This, he realized, was his mistake. The hint of defiance, the refusal to be cowed, was a challenge Miller could not ignore. The officer's posture straightened, his casual intimidation condensing into focused aggression. All right, that's enough. On your feet. You're coming with me. On what grounds? Arthur demanded, the question sharp and precise, the same one he had posed to countless prosecutors from his bench. Failure to identify, suspicion of vagrancy, and a bad attitude, Miller growled, reaching for his handcuffs. Now get up, or I'll make you get up. Arthur looked from the officer's angry face to the sketchbook in his lap. He thought of Eleanor. He thought of the promise. See the world, Arthur. He was seeing it now, all right. He was seeing its ugliest, most ignorant corner up close. He knew he could say the words. He could utter the sentence that would stop all of this. I am Judge Arthur Caldwell. But the moment he did, he would cease to be the man on the bench and become the title. The very anonymity he had sought would be shattered, and the purity of this place, Eleanor's place, would be tainted forever by the intrusion of his public life. More than that, a stubborn, fiery piece of him, the piece that had clawed its way from the bottom to the top, refused to use his title as a shield. Why should he have to? His identity as a man, as a citizen, should be enough. So he stayed silent about his profession. He slowly closed his sketchbook, holding it protectively to his chest, and stood up. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into his wrists. They were cinched too tight, a petty act of cruelty. Miller shoved him forward, a rough, unnecessary gesture of dominance. As he was marched out of the park, a pariah in his own sanctuary, Arthur caught the eye of the little boy with the toy boat. The boy's frown was no longer one of concentration, but of confusion and fear. In that moment, Arthur's personal indignation transformed into a cold, hard resolve. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about that boy. It was about every person who had ever been judged by the color of their skin or the age of their clothes. Officer Miller thought he was arresting a nobody. He had no idea he had just arrested the very law he claimed to serve. And tomorrow, in a courtroom less than a mile away, that law was going to call him to account. The thought was not one of vengeance, but of a profound, impending justice. The scales, Arthur vowed, were about to be balanced. The ride to the precinct was a study in practice degradation. Officer Miller drove with one hand, the other drumming a self-satisfied rhythm on the dashboard. He didn't speak to Arthur, but he spoke about him over the radio, his voice laced with a casual contempt that made Arthur's blood run cold. Got another transient from Westlake. Miller's voice crackled. Yeah, one of the usuals. Non-compliant. Refused to ID. Probably has a sheet a mile long. Arthur sat in the back, the cage's wire mesh pressing a diamond pattern into his cheek. He listened to the litany of lies, each one a brick being laid in the wall of a false narrative. He was no longer a man sketching in a park. He was a transient, a usual, a non-compliant problem to be processed and forgotten. The ease with which Miller constructed the fiction was chilling. How many others had been painted into a corner by this man's lies? He thought back to his own youth, growing up in the city's forgotten borough. He had seen faces like Miller's then, too. Cops who saw a group of black teenagers and saw a gang, who saw ambition and saw arrogance. He had decided then, at 17, after a friend was wrongly arrested, that he would not be a victim of the system. He would learn its language, its rules, its intricate architecture, until he could command it. He went to law school at night, working as a janitor during the day to pay for it. He remembered mopping the floors of a prestigious law firm, listening to the partners discuss cases, absorbing their strategies, their confidence. He remembered the sting of being invisible, of being looked through as if he were part of the furniture. But he had used that invisibility. He had listened. He had learned. Eleanor had been his rock. She was a librarian who believed in the power of stories, and she saw the makings of a great one in him. You're not just learning the law, Arthur, she told him, her hand on his as he studied late into the night. You're learning how to write the final chapter for people who can't. He had made it. Assistant district attorney. Then, after years of fighting from that side, he'd become a defense attorney, wanting to stand for those who had no one. Finally, 15 years ago, A governorship appointment had placed him on the bench of the Superior Court. Judge Arthur Caldwell, a name that commanded respect, a name synonymous with fairness and an unyielding adherence to the spirit, not just the letter, of the law. But in the back of this police car, that name meant nothing. Here, he was just another black body caught in the gears of a machine that men like Miller operated with impunity. The precinct was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouted conversations, and the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Miller shoved Arthur toward the booking desk, his hand tight on his arm. "What we got, Miller?" the desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Russo, asked without looking up from his paperwork. "Vagrancy, failure to ID. Found him casing the park. Real piece of work," Miller announced, loud enough for everyone in the bullpen to hear. He pushed Arthur against the desk. "Empty your pockets." Arthur slowly placed his keys on the grimy counter. Then, the few crumpled bills. "That's it," Miller scoffed. He snatched the sketchbook from under Arthur's arm. "What's this?" "Your master plan." He flipped it open. His cynical eyes scanned the detailed sketches of flowers, of children playing, of the very oak tree under which he had arrested Arthur. A flicker of something, confusion, disappointment, crossed his face. This was not the work of a criminal. It was the work of an artist. But the narrative was already written. He couldn't deviate from it now. "Cute," Miller sneered, tossing the sketchbook into a plastic bin with a clatter. "You can add it to the evidence locker." A cold fury, unlike anything Arthur had felt in years, coiled in his gut. The confiscation of his person was an indignity. The confiscation of that book was a violation. It was Eleanor's last gift. It held the quiet moments of his life for the past 5 years since she'd been gone. "That book is my personal property," Arthur said, his voice dangerously low. "It has no evidentiary value. I want it back." "You want a lot of things, old man," Miller retorted, enjoying his power. "You'll get it back when we say so. Now, face the wall." The flash of the camera was blinding. The ink on his fingertips was cold and sticky. He was photographed, fingerprinted, processed. He gave his name, Arthur Caldwell, and his date of birth. He refused to give a home address, simply stating he would provide it in court. Let them think what they wanted. Let them believe he was homeless. It would make tomorrow's lesson all the more potent. The name Caldwell didn't seem to register with anyone. To them, it was just a name, devoid of the weight and history he had spent a lifetime building. He was invisible again, just like he had been mopping those law firm floors all those years ago. They led him to a holding cell. The heavy metal door slammed shut with a deafening clang of finality. The cell was crowded, a microcosm of the city's despair. A young man in the corner was crying softly, his face buried in his hands. An older man, reeking of cheap wine, was asleep on the floor. 2 others argued in hushed, angry tones. Arthur found a small space on the cold, concrete bench and sat down. The reality of his situation settled in. He was trapped. For the next 12 hours, his life was not his own. His title, his reputation, his entire identity beyond these walls was utterly useless. He looked at the crying boy. He couldn't have been more than 18. He was wearing a fast food uniform, stained with grease. "What are you in for?" Arthur asked gently. The boy looked up, his eyes red and swollen. "They said I fit the description," he whispered, the words a bitter echo of Arthur's own experience. "There was a robbery a block from my work. I was just walking to the bus stop. They just grabbed me." "Did you ask for a lawyer?" The boy shook his head. "I can't afford a lawyer. They said if I was innocent, I had nothing to worry about. But the way that one cop looked at me, he already decided I was guilty." Arthur recognized the look in the boy's eyes. It was the death of faith. The moment a citizen realizes the shields of justice are not there to protect them. It was a look he had dedicated his life to preventing. He felt a surge of his old defense attorney instincts. He couldn't wear the robe in here, but he could still offer the wisdom it represented. "Listen to me," Arthur said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the boy's fear. "When you go before the judge tomorrow, you will plead not guilty. You will state clearly that you were on your way home from your job at," he paused. "Burger Barn," the boy mumbled. "At Burger Barn. You will request a public defender. Do not say anything else. Do not try to explain. Just state the facts. Your name is Kevin. Kevin Johnson. All right, Kevin. You have rights. That uniform you're wearing is a kind of proof. Your employer can verify your work schedule. They may have surveillance video of you leaving. This is an alibi. Do you understand? Kevin nodded, a spark of hope igniting in his terrified eyes. He wiped his tears on his sleeve. Yeah, I think so. For the next hour, Arthur spoke to him, not as a judge, but as a mentor. He explained the arraignment process, the importance of specific language, how to carry himself before the court. He was doing it quietly, but one of the other men in the cell was listening intently. The cell door rattled open. It was Miller. His eyes scanned the occupants and landed on Arthur. A smug grin spread across his face. Well, look at the jailhouse lawyer, Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. Trying to organize my prisoners? That could be another charge. Inciting. He was twisting Arthur's act of counsel into something sinister. He was building his false case, brick by brick. He looked at Kevin. Don't listen to this old fool. He'll just get you in more trouble. Miller's gaze returned to Arthur. You know, I ran your prints. Nothing came up. A clean slate. That's rare for your type. Makes me think you're just new in town. Or you're very, very sneaky. The condescension, the casual racism, the abuse of power, it was all on full display. Arthur simply stared back at him, his expression unreadable. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a reaction. His response would come later, in a place where his words had the force of law. Enjoy your stay, Miller sneered, and slammed the door shut again. The night stretched on, an eternity of cold concrete and the quiet desperation of caged men. Arthur did not sleep. He sat with his back against the wall, his mind a whirlwind. He thought of the thousands of men and women who passed through cells like this one every year. How many were innocent like Kevin? How many were victims of officers like Miller, petty tyrants who wielded their badges like crowns? The system he loved, the system he had sworn to uphold, was being poisoned from the inside by these men. And he, in his elevated position, had been insulated from its rawest, ugliest truths. He read reports, he heard testimony, but he had not felt it. Not like this. He hadn't felt the chill of the concrete seeping into his bones. He hadn't felt the sting of baseless accusations. He hadn't felt the utter powerlessness of having his identity, his very humanity, stripped away and replaced with a number and a charge. This arrest, this humiliating ordeal, was no longer a curse. It was a revelation, a necessary, painful education. Eleanor had told him to see the world. She never said it would always be beautiful. As the first gray hints of dawn filtered through the high, barred window, a new resolve settled over him. His initial plan had been simple: reveal himself in court, have the charges dropped, and ensure Miller faced a reprimand. Now, that was not enough. A reprimand was paperwork. A suspension was a paid vacation. This was not a problem of one bad officer. This was a sickness in the culture of the department, a sickness that allowed a man like Miller to flourish. He wasn't just going to get justice for himself. He was going to perform surgery. The morning brought the clatter of food trays and the guards' gruff shouts. They were herded out of the cell, chained together in a line, and loaded into a transport van. The indignity continued. He was shackled to the young man, Kevin, who looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and renewed fear. Just remember what I told you, Arthur whispered as the van rumbled through the city streets. They arrived at the county courthouse. His courthouse. It was a surreal experience, entering the building he knew so intimately through the prisoner's entrance. He walked down hallways he usually strode with purpose, but now he was just part of a shuffling, chained procession. He saw bailiffs who usually nodded to him with a respectful, "Good morning, Your Honor," today. They looked through him, their faces impassive. He was invisible again. They were led into a large holding pen behind the main arraignment court, courtroom 3B. His courtroom. The irony was so thick he could taste it. He was scheduled to preside over this very session today. He wondered who they had called in to replace him when he didn't show up. His clerk, Maria, would have been frantic. From the pen, he could hear the familiar sounds of the courtroom coming to life. The low murmur of lawyers talking to clients, the clerk's call to order. He looked through the reinforced glass window and saw him. Officer Miller. He was standing near the prosecution table, chatting amiably with a young assistant district attorney. He looked confident, relaxed. He was holding a file, Arthur's file, and he gestured with it as he spoke, a self-satisfied smirk on his face. He was the hero of his own story, the diligent cop who had cleaned up the park. The sight of that smirk, that unearned confidence, cemented Arthur's resolve into something as hard as diamond. The bailiff, a burly man named Henderson who had worked in Arthur's court for a decade, unlocked the pen. "All right, let's go. Single file. When your name is called, step up to the table." Henderson's eyes swept over the line of men and didn't even register Arthur's presence. The anonymity was absolute. They filed into the courtroom and sat on the hard wooden benches reserved for defendants. Arthur kept his head down, observing. The visiting judge, Judge Peterson, was on the bench. He was a decent man, but known for being overworked and moving through his docket at a blistering pace. He would be relying heavily on the arresting officer's report. He saw his clerk, Maria, looking stressed. She kept glancing at the door to his chambers, then back at her phone. She would have been calling him all morning. He felt a pang of guilt for the worry he was causing her. The first few cases were called. Minor shoplifting, a DUI. Peterson was efficient, setting bail, assigning court dates. Then, the clerk called the next name. The People versus Kevin Johnson. Kevin, sitting next to Arthur, tensed up. He took a shaky breath. "You can do this," Arthur whispered. Kevin shuffled forward. Officer Miller stepped up to the prosecution table, ready to give his version of the arrest. "Mr. Johnson," Judge Peterson said, barely looking up from the file, "you're charged with suspicion of armed robbery. How do you plead?" Kevin's eyes were wide with terror. He looked back at Arthur, who gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Kevin said, his voice trembling but clear. "I was walking home from my job at Burger Barn." The ADA sighed, a theatrical display of impatience. "Your Honor, the defendant was apprehended less than a block from the scene, and he matches the witness's general description. He was acting suspiciously." "I was not," Kevin blurted out. "Silence," Judge Peterson snapped. Miller smirked. It was all going according to the script. But Arthur knew he couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let Kevin's life be ruined before his own drama played out. He had to intervene. But how? If he spoke up now, he would be just another defendant, dragged out for contempt of court. He needed a different kind of intervention. He caught Maria's eye. For a split second, he lifted his head and let her see him. Really see him. Her eyes widened. Her jaw dropped. A flash of disbelief, then confusion, then dawning comprehension spread across her face. She looked from Arthur's disheveled state to Officer Miller, and then back again. Her sharp mind began connecting the dots. Arthur gave her the slightest shake of his head, a silent command to stay quiet. But he also gave her a look she knew well. It was the look he got when a lawyer was trying to pull a fast one, a look that said, "I need you to do something, right now." Maria, ever the professional, recovered in an instant. She stood up and approached the bench. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying a new, urgent authority. "I apologize for the interruption, but there has been an administrative issue. I need to request a brief, 5-minute recess. It concerns Judge Caldwell." Judge Peterson looked annoyed. "What about Judge Caldwell? Has he been located?" "In a manner of speaking, yes," Maria said, her gaze flicking meaningfully toward the defendant's bench. "A matter has come to my attention that requires his immediate presence. I believe he can clear up several items on today's docket." Peterson, confused but trusting the veteran clerk, banged his gavel. "Fine. 5-minute recess." He stood and swept out of the courtroom toward the chambers. Miller looked confused. What did Judge Caldwell have to do with any of this? As soon as the judge was gone, Maria walked with brisk, determined steps not to her desk, but directly to the bailiff, Henderson. "I need you to uncuff one of the defendants," she whispered urgently, handing him a key. The older gentleman in the gray hoodie. "His name is Arthur Caldwell." Henderson's face was a comical mask of confusion. "Maria, what are you talking about?" That's one of the vagrants Miller brought in from the park." "Henderson," Maria said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. "That vagrant is the man who signs your paycheck. That is Judge Arthur Caldwell. Now do it. Quietly." The color drained from Henderson's face. He looked over at Arthur, his eyes truly seeing him for the first time. He saw the familiar posture, the intelligent eyes, the quiet dignity that no amount of grime or frayed clothing could hide. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. Henderson moved quickly, his professionalism kicking in. He walked over to Arthur. "Sir," he mumbled, his voice thick with shock and apology. My profound apologies. He unlocked Arthur's handcuffs. The soft click of the cuffs opening was louder than a gunshot in the suddenly quiet courtroom. Officer Miller watched the exchange, his smug expression melting into a puddle of confusion and alarm. Why was the bailiff uncuffing his prisoner? Why was the clerk involved? Arthur stood up, rubbing his wrists. He gave Henderson a gracious nod. Then he turned to Maria. Maria, he said, his voice calm but resonant, the voice that had commanded this room for 15 years. Would you please retrieve my robe? The courtroom, which had been buzzing with confused whispers, fell into a stunned, absolute silence. Every eye, the lawyers, the other defendants, the court reporter, was now locked on the disheveled man in the gray hoodie. Officer Miller's face had gone from confused to horrified. His mouth hung open. The file slipped from his nerveless fingers and scattered papers across the floor. He was staring at Arthur as if he were an apparition. Caldwell. The name from the booking sheet. It couldn't be. Maria, her expression a perfect blend of fury and vindication, nodded sharply. Right away, Your Honor. She turned on her heel and disappeared through the door that led to the judge's chambers. Arthur Caldwell stood there for a moment, in the center of the courtroom, no longer a prisoner, not yet a judge. He was a man caught between two worlds, and in that moment, he was the most powerful person in the room. He let his gaze sweep over the assembled people, letting them absorb the impossible truth of what was happening. Then, his eyes found Officer Miller. He held the young officer's terrified gaze and said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence was his indictment. The door to the chambers opened again. Maria emerged, holding the black judicial robe as if it were a sacred text. She walked to Arthur and held it open for him. With a slow, deliberate motion, Arthur slipped off his stained gray hoodie. Underneath, he wore a simple, clean white shirt. He then turned and slid his arms into the sleeves of his robe. The transformation was instantaneous and profound. The fabric settled over his shoulders, and with it, the full weight and authority of his office. He was no longer a vagrant, a suspect, a number. He was the embodiment of the law. He was Judge Arthur Caldwell. He walked, not to the defendant's bench, but toward the elevated platform at the front of the room. He ascended the 2 steps with a familiar, steady gait. The entire courtroom watched, mesmerized, as he took his seat in the high-backed leather chair. His chair. He picked up the gavel. Its polished wood felt cool and solid in his hand. He looked out over the stunned faces. He saw Kevin Johnson, whose mouth was agape in sheer disbelief. He saw the other defendants, their expressions a mix of awe and burgeoning hope. He saw the lawyers, frozen in place, trying to process the tectonic shift that had just occurred. And he saw Officer Miller, who was now ashen-faced, trembling, a man who had just watched his entire world collapse. Arthur brought the gavel down. The sharp crack echoed through the silent room. This court is now in session, he declared, his voice booming with an authority that was absolute. The Honorable Judge Arthur Caldwell presiding. He paused, letting the reality of the statement settle in. First, he said, his eyes locking onto the ADA, the charges against Mr. Kevin Johnson are dismissed with prejudice, due to a clear and demonstrable case of wrongful arrest and profiling. Mr. Johnson, you are free to go. The court extends its sincerest apologies for your ordeal. Kevin stood frozen for a moment. Then a wave of relief so powerful it made him buckle washed over him. Tears streamed down his face as a bailiff gently guided him out of the courtroom, a free man. Arthur's gaze then shifted, landing like a physical weight on the paralyzed form of Officer Miller. Officer Miller, Judge Caldwell said, his voice dropping to a dangerously calm level. Please approach the witness stand. It was not a request. Miller moved as if in a trance, his polished boots scuffing on the floor. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. He stumbled into the witness box and stood there, unable to meet the judge's piercing gaze. He did not ask to be sworn in. He knew this was not about testimony. This was a reckoning. Officer Miller, Arthur began, his voice devoid of anger, filled instead with a profound, disappointed gravity. Yesterday, in Westlake Park, you arrested a man for fitting the description you accused him of vagrancy, of being a public nuisance. You did not listen to him. You did not treat him with a shred of human dignity. You saw his clothes, you saw the color of his skin, and you made a judgment. He leaned forward. That is my job, not yours. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He tried to speak, but only a choked squeak came out. You then compounded this error, the judge continued, his voice rising slightly, echoing the moral authority he now fully embodied. You filed a false report. You used language like non-compliant to describe a man who simply asked on what grounds he was being arrested, a fundamental right of every citizen. You confiscated his personal property without cause, a sketchbook you mocked as a criminal's tool. Arthur paused, his eyes narrowing. Where is that sketchbook now, Officer Miller? It's in the precinct evidence locker, Your Honor, Miller stammered, the words Your Honor sounding like a plea for mercy. I see. So you logged a book of charcoal drawings as evidence of vagrancy. A truly brilliant piece of police work, Judge Caldwell said, the sarcasm as sharp as a razor. And then, this morning, in this very courtroom, I heard you conspiring with the assistant district attorney to prosecute an innocent young man, Kevin Johnson, based on this same flimsy, prejudiced foundation. He pointed a finger at Miller, the gesture as damning as a verdict. You, sir, are not a peace officer. You are a petty tyrant who uses his badge as a weapon against the very people you swore an oath to protect. You are a cancer on the body of justice. The courtroom was so quiet, the hum of the fluorescent lights was audible. Bailiff, Judge Caldwell commanded, please contact the chief of police. Inform him that I request his immediate presence in my courtroom, and inform him that I will be filing a formal complaint against Officer Miller for perjury, filing a false report, and a litany of civil rights violations. Miller's legs finally gave out. He slumped against the side of the witness box, his face a mask of utter ruin. His career was over. He knew it. Everyone in the room knew it. As for the remaining individuals on this morning's docket who were arrested by Officer Miller, the judge announced, his voice sweeping across the defendant's bench, all charges are hereby dismissed. This court has zero confidence in any arrest report filed by this officer. A wave of gasps and relieved sobs rippled through the defendants. They were looking at Arthur not just as a judge, but as a savior. Officer Miller, Arthur said, his voice softening slightly, not with pity, but with a final, somber finality. You are dismissed from this courtroom. I suspect it will be the last time you set foot in one, unless it is as a defendant. Henderson, his face grim, escorted the broken officer out of the courtroom. The doors swung shut behind him, closing the chapter on a corrupted career. Arthur took a deep breath. He looked at the empty witness stand, then at the faces of the people whose lives had been irrevocably changed that morning. His night in jail, the humiliation, the cold, it had all been worth it to bring this moment to pass. He had not just presided over the law. He had embodied its promise. Within the hour, Police Chief Michaels stood before him, his expression a mixture of deep embarrassment and grim resolve. He was a good man, a man Arthur respected, but he was at the helm of a ship with rot in its hull. Judge Caldwell. Arthur, the chief began, his voice low. There are no words. I was briefed by my deputy. I have seen the preliminary report from your clerk. I am appalled. Appalled is a start, Chief. Arthur replied from his chair on the bench, the courtroom now empty save for them, Maria, and two bailiffs. But it is not a solution. Officer Miller has been suspended indefinitely, pending termination, the chief said quickly. His badge and weapon have been confiscated. I've already opened an internal affairs investigation that will be thorough and, I assure you, brutal. That deals with the symptom, Frank, not the disease, Arthur countered, his tone firm. Miller is not an anomaly. He is a product of a culture that allows his kind of thinking to fester. He felt comfortable. He felt empowered to do what he did because he believed there would be no consequences. He leaned forward, his judicial robe rustling. For 12 hours, I was not Judge Caldwell. I was just a black man in your system. And I can tell you, Frank, the system is broken. It is cold, it is cruel, and it is blind in all the wrong ways. It is blind to innocence but sees guilt in the color of a man's skin. The chief had the decency to look ashamed. He nodded slowly. What do you propose? This was the moment. The reason this ordeal had meaning beyond his own vindication. I am creating a judicial task force on police conduct and community relations, Arthur announced. It will have subpoena power. It will review arrest protocols, training manuals, and every single complaint filed against an officer for the last 5 years. It will be chaired by me, and I expect your full, unreserved cooperation. It was not a request. It was a judicial order cloaked in the language of collaboration. You'll have it, the chief said without hesitation. Whatever you need. Records, personnel, anything. Good, Arthur said. Your first act of cooperation will be to retrieve my sketchbook from your evidence locker and have it delivered to my chambers within the hour. Personally, a faint, grim smile touched the chief's lips. Consider it done, Your Honor. An hour later, Arthur sat in his chambers, the heavy oak door closed against the world. The leather of his chair felt more comfortable than it ever had before. On his polished desk, next to a stack of legal briefs, sat his worn sketchbook. Chief Michaels had delivered it himself, his apology even more profound in the privacy of the chambers. Arthur picked it up. He ran his hand over the familiar, soft leather. He opened it to the last page he had worked on, the unfinished drawing of the duck's wing. His charcoal-smudged fingerprint was still visible in the corner of the page. He had gone to the park to see the world. He had ended up in a cage. But in doing so, he had been given a terrible, clarifying gift. He now saw the world not just from the privileged height of the bench, but from the cold, hard floor of the cell. He understood, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that his robe was not just a symbol of authority. It was a shield that men like Kevin Johnson did not have, a shield that he himself had been without for one day, with devastating consequences. His work, he realized, was not just about interpreting the law. It was about reinforcing the shield for everyone, regardless of who they were or what they wore. 6 months later, the Caldwell Task Force was a name that inspired both hope and fear. Its public hearings had become front-page news, exposing systemic issues within the police department that had been ignored for decades. Arthur, true to his word, chaired every meeting. He was relentless, using his judicial mind to dissect police reports and his newfound experience to understand the human cost behind them. His work led to the complete overhaul of the department's training on implicit bias and de-escalation. A new, powerful, and independent civilian review board was established, with real teeth to discipline and fire officers who abused their power. Officer Miller's termination had been swift. The last Arthur heard, he was working as a night watchman for a used car lot on the edge of town, a cautionary tale whispered among the rookies at the academy. He had been thoroughly and justly disgraced. Arthur had also started a mentorship program, pairing judges and senior lawyers with at-risk youth. His first mentee was Kevin Johnson. The charges against him had been fully expunged, and with a letter of recommendation from Judge Caldwell himself, Kevin had enrolled in community college, his faith in the system, and himself slowly being rebuilt. This afternoon, Arthur found himself back on his bench in Westlake Park. It was the first time he had returned since the arrest. He wore the same gray hoodie and faded jeans. In his lap was the same leather-bound sketchbook. The air was warm, the sun was bright, and the ducks glided peacefully across the pond. It was all exactly as it had been. And yet, everything was different. He was no longer just here to see the world. He was here to change it. He picked up his piece of charcoal, the familiar texture a comfort in his hand. He looked around, at the faces of the people enjoying their small pocket of peace. He felt a profound sense of responsibility to them, to the promise of this park, to the promise of the nation itself. He put the charcoal to the page and began to sketch, his hand steady, his purpose clear. He was drawing the blueprint for a better world, one just line at a time.